was dark, and I see this shape in Artist Row, and this is the Seth Moulton's office on the left, and hidden behind a bunch of trees, I run into Salem's most famous architect and woodcarver, Samuel McIntire. And some of you may remember this statue. It was carved out of a trunk of a tree that was left up on the common after the tree that was taken down, and it sat there for a couple of years. And I always wondered what happened to Mac. And here he is. He's right across from the lobster shanty, hidden by the bushes or whatever. But so I went back during the day and got a shot of him. But McIntire is certainly the big name around here. And I've always said McIntire is to architecture what Hawthorne is to literature, Frank Benson is to art, Elizabeth Peabody to education, et cetera, et cetera. He is the number one. But just like everybody else that's tops in their field here in Salem, like George Parker in industry, there's always other people that certainly deserve some note. They may not be the most important or the best known, but they've made great contributions. And you look at the Bertram Emerton clan; they're the people you always think of in terms of philanthropy. But then you have Robert Brookhouse and Carolyn Plummer and all sorts of other people. And so there's a lot of other architects, and I think I once went to a lecture given by John Goff, something along these lines. And Samuel McIntire, we've got to mention him. This isn't about him, it's about the others. But born in Salem in 1757 and died in 1811, lived in Salem his entire life, worked not exclusively, but primarily in Salem. Can anybody mute everybody? But so it's and in the beginning of his career, he did everything. McIntire was born into a family of housewrights. His father, his uncles, his cousins, and everybody worked as housewrights, and they worked on ships. And he was lucky; he caught on early. Ended up doing a lot of work for Derby family, and that was a good way to become a number one guy in Salem. But in the beginning, the architecture, they think this was his first commission, the Purse Nichols house on Federal Street, and this was in the late Georgian period. So the houses were elegant. And they showed the fact that the owners had a lot of money, but they didn't have that delicacy that his later buildings did. I always say this building could take a direct hit from a bomb. They're solidly built, but they're symmetrical and they're beautiful and they're opulent. But what happens as time goes on in the 1790s, he starts evolving his style to what they call the Adamist Federal style, and that's much more delicate. And it comes out of Europe. The Adams brothers, Robert Adams, and the British Isles had adopted it, from the south of Europe, and some of the elements of it, and again, it was all derived from the excavations they did at Pompeii and Herculaneum, early in the 18th century. And then people started adopting some of the old, classical things like the Palladian windows, and you'd have everything would be very rectangular and delicate rather than boxy and square. And instead of square chimneys, you had very tall, thin chimneys. And a lot of times you'd have this belt course that separated the floors. And but the Palladian windows that are recessed here were a big element of it. And that's Hamilton Hall. But McIntire's major building, really, the one that he's best known for, and it gets pressed. Every book on American architecture practically features it, if they include that era, is the Gardner Pingree House. And it was designed by McIntire, 1804, 1805, owned by John Gardner for a few years till he lost everything and passed through different hands. And the Pingree family gave it to the Essex Institute, now the Peabody Essex Museum. And this is one of the quintessential Adamist Federal buildings. And you have a central doorway. Symmetry is everything. Delicacy, scale is everything. You've got 6/6 windows. You've got the central doorway with the fan light window over the top. The side lights, as you can barely see, go halfway down. Over each window, you have the lintel. These are keystone lentils. You have a keystone here. You have this belt course that separates the floors between each floor. And when you get up to the third floors are foreshortened for a number of purposes. Again, the chimneys were tall and thin. So this thing is just absolutely elegant, delicate, and exquisite. And it's going to give us a good jumping off spot for a lot of the other houses and architects we're going to be talking about. And I'm not really going to get too deeply into architectural styles so much, or a little bit of everything. But I like the people, and we're going to kind of look at that. But here's some of the people we're going to be looking at. And the very first one is Charles Bulfinch, and everybody knows his name. Born in 1763, a Boston guy, died in 1844. And there's a wonderful picture of him. He looks like a man that's doing very well, nice ruffled feathers and or lace, whatever. But He went to Harvard as a young man. He started a lot earlier, and he got out of Harvard in 1784. Even got a master's, which I didn't realize they had master's degrees back then. And he wanted to be an architect, so he went over to Europe because they didn't have architects really in this country at that point. And while he was in Europe, he stumbled on to Thomas Jefferson, who basically plotted out an itinerary for him and said, "Go here, see this, da 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 da." And he was shrewd enough to do what he was told. And in the British Isles, he ran into Robert Adams and starts adopting that neoclassical, or what became known as the Adams Federal style. So when he comes back in the 1790s, he starts designing buildings. Some of them are residential, some of them are public buildings, but you see a lot of those neoclassical elements. Again, the symmetry. You see these doorways, how these round arch, very popular, round arch recessed doorways. You see the Palladian windows up here. Some are full Palladian, others are just modified. You don't have the little fan lights here. And so everything about it is just very delicate, very balanced. The second floor, you have these wonderful columns, and you have a little extra up here with well, this will happen. I forget the word I'm going to use or whatever. But anyway, this is the State House in Boston, and he designed it, before 1800. And this is one of the great houses he designed, and it's on Cambridge Street. And there you look again. Here we have the fan light window. You have the Palladian window, and you have a little lunette or another fan light window up here. And you see this up and down Chestnut Street. Well, in some houses where you'll have like that fan light repeated on each floor, one way or the other. But again, this is the Harrison Gray Otis house, and you've got 6/6 windows, everything. And this is not quite as fancy as the Gardner Pingree. It doesn't have that like portico and everything else that's going on. But anyway, this was his new style, and he becomes really the promoter of this whole neoclassical style, which becomes known as the Adams Federal when you're talking about McIntire, and because of Robert Adams and that style. So anyway, and then what happens to Bulfinch is he goes on to become the third architect and the final one for the U.S. Capitol building. And he does the rotunda and other pieces. So he lived down in Washington for 11 years. So, and finally he finished the Capitol building. But he did come up to Salem, and that's why I've included him in here. And what happens in Salem, there used to be an almshouse on the Salem Common, up in the corner about where the Knights of Columbus was until recently. And the almshouse was the poorhouse, and that was all right to have it there because it was a swamp. But once they started turning that swamp in the common into a residential neighborhood instead of an industrial neighborhood, they got rid of the almshouse. So they had to build a new one. And who do they bring in? At the time when Salem is really starting to tank economically, they bring in Charles Bulfinch, one of the most expensive architects in the country, and really the first trained architect in this country to design the new almshouse and poor farm. So this is down right across the street from Bentley School. It's condos now. So he designed it in 1815 or 16, and that was built according to his designs right in Collins Cove. And it was there for many years. It didn't get torn down until 1953, and they later built a farm to go along with it. So they had the almshouse and the farm. So it was an absolutely stunning complex. What went on inside it was a different story entirely. It was almost as bad as the exterior was good. But anyway, it was wonderful to have a Bulfinch building here in Salem, since he was sort of the father of all architects in this country. But the other building he did, and it's still here, if you go to Red's for lunch or breakfast, which most people do at some point or other in their lives, right next to Red's is the old fraternity building. And Caroline Emerton bought this at one point and gave it to the Salem fraternity, the Boys Club. But prior to that, initially it was built by Bulfinch, designed by Bulfinch for a bank. And the bank did all right until an insider and an outsider got together and really skimmed and stole some of the depositors blind, and the bank eventually went bankrupt. But so anyway, this building has undergone any number of changes, but it's got this wonderful welcome stairway. It goes up from both sides, and now some new businesses in there. I don't know what it is, very kind of quiet. But so anyway, this was a Charles Bulfinch building, and it's still here. And Bulfinch worked, pretty much in the Boston area. So to have a couple of his buildings out here is very, very impressive. So let's go back to our touchstone. I'll go back to this building periodically, but there's back to the Gardner Pingree house. And it's wonderful. Within one block of the Gardner Pingree house are opportunities to introduce you to other architects that worked intensely in Salem and they really were very well known in their time. And just to the left of the Gardner Pingree House is this wonderful Italianate residence built probably in the 1850s, and called the Tucker Deland House, D-E-L-A-N-D. And Deland was a big time mariner, merchant, made a lot of money in the maritime trade, and he wanted to build a mansion. At the time he's building it in 1850, the days of the federal period, like the Gardner Pingree House, had gone. The federal period had given away to the Greek revival and maybe even the Gothic revival, and now is going to Italianate. And there's something very delicate about the Italianate, something very elegant. And these were brick and brownstone. You can see the facade is brick, but all these elements here, the trim, the hoods over the windows, that's all brownstone. And John Goff, who is a wonderful architectural historian and sadly moved to Florida and left us high and dry, but John did a wonderful article about brownstone, and he said the center of brownstone in America is Portland, Connecticut, which is about halfway between Hartford and New Haven, and that's where all the brownstone came from. And brownstone was very popular in the Italianate style. Unfortunately, it's very soft and porous, and acid rain does a horrible job on it. But anyway, so this was a private residence, and it's Italianate, and sometimes an Italianate will have almost full-length mirror windows, floor to ceiling. There's one on Chestnut Street, right next to the Phillips House, I think, that does. And you'll notice the hoods over each window on each floor are often different. They might vary just a little bit. This doesn't have any brackets, and up top they're sort of dripped hole molding. So, but they were all done in brownstone. Sometimes on an Italianate building, each floor the windows will get a little bit smaller, not always, but anyway, very high style, beautiful portico. And what you have here, you see the capitals here. These are Corinthian, the sort of flowered capitals on top of the columns, and that's a sign of real high fashion. So this building was designed by a guy who really wasn't doing a lot of other work along this line, at least at this point, a guy named Gridley J.F. Bryant. And there's Gridley J.F., lived from 1866 to I can't see it because somebody's name is up there, 99 or whatever. But Bryant was a fascinating guy. And he grew up, was born in Boston, and his father was an engineer. And his father did something that was wonderful for industry on the South Shore. And everybody's heard, I'm sure, at one point or other about Quincy granite. And before Rockport granite, there was Quincy granite. Before a lot of New Hampshire granite, there was Quincy granite, because Quincy granite was so close to Boston. And remember, the thing that really boosted its visibility was when they built the Bunker Hill Monument. They built that all out of granite from Quincy. So, but anyway, Gridley J.F. Bryant's father, Gridley Bryant, what he did was, he was an engineer, so he built the railroad. And it might be one of the first railroads. It is one of the first railroads in America, and could be first. And that railroad, all it did was go from the Quincy quarries 3 miles to the Neponset River. And then what you did was you took the granite and you put on these ships, and they would take it wherever it had to go from that point on. So this was available, to transport the granite, which is more important almost than getting it out of the ground, because, then you could have something to do with it. So Gridley J.F. decides he doesn't want to be an engineer, but he likes architecture. So he studies architecture. Then he apprentices himself to a guy named Paris. And Paris was, like Samuel McIntire, sort of followed in the footsteps of Bulfinch in that Adam S. Federal style. And he became most famous for doing the Quincy Market Building. And Paris was a very busy guy in the Boston area. So an apprenticeship with him was good. There's Faneuil Hall at the end. So Gridley J.F. Bryant gets out and he gets to work. And some of the buildings he did, they said in his time, up until his death in the 1890s, he was the busiest architect in Boston. And one of the things that he would do is he would create these cookie cutters for, like, maybe jails or mental hospitals or buildings that could be copied, and that made him some serious money. But he was just so busy. And of course, because of his father's contribution, that railroad that made it possible to get the granite to where it needed to be, he obviously built a lot in granite. And granite was wonderful because it lasted forever. And if there was a fire, your building had a chance of surviving. And also granite became very popular during the, when they were building civic buildings in the time of the Greek revival, in the beginning of the 1800s or whatever. Greek revival became popular, and a lot of these wonderful buildings look very good in granite. So anyway, this is Horticultural Hall in Boston. He built that. this is the old City Hall in Boston on School Street. What an absolutely stunning building, and he designed this. And of course, his taste and style changed sometimes because it was just changing with the times, and other times it's because of what the client wanted. He was very successful, made a lot of money, and was busy all the time, but he also needed to always please the clients, as always. But this was Charles Street Jail, and he built that. And of course, it's built of granite, which is what you want a jail to be built of in the scenario view. And I looked forever for this picture. See this little thing down there? Anybody remember Buzzy's roast beef?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Buzzy's. Yeah. So there's a picture of Buzzy's in it. Now, what a loss that was when it went down. But it was tucked in. They used to say the prisoners would yell out the windows with their orders, but it was open all night. So the Charles Street Jail. So these are big buildings, and he did so many others. But unfortunately, in 1872, there was a fire in Boston that wiped out a lot of the downtown. And people had hired him to do buildings, maybe were luckier than others because he built a lot out of granite. But he certainly rebuilt a lot after the fire or whatever. But he also came to Salem, and again, he worked everywhere in the country. And because, part of it was because he would develop these sort of cookie cutter models that could be replicated. But he came to Salem and built really one of the most famous buildings ever to be erected in Salem, and one of the most infamous ever to be torn down. And every time I see a picture of this, I think you go to Europe to see buildings like this, and what did Salem do in 1954? They tore it down. But anyway, at the bottom of Washington Street, there used to be, for about 10 years after the train came into Salem, there's a small wooden train station that actually sat on a wharf, and the trains came in over the South River on raised tracks. But they decided the time had come. Salem's modernizing. We became a city in 1836. Salem's industry is exploding. Now we've got cotton mills and leather factories and shoe factories and all sorts of interesting business. But industry is exploding here, and so is the population. The population went from about 10,000 in 1800 to 20,000 in 1850. And part of that was because of the Irish migration, and then it would double almost again by the end of the century. So you have, in the period that we're going to be primarily talking about from this point on, you have this exploding population, and you have this modernizing going on in the city. And once the railroad comes in, and then the trolleys come in, and I don't know if people know this, but one of the biggest industries in Salem was down where the power plant is. Salem became a major transshipping port for coal. There were 2 wharves down there, right near where the power plant is now, and so much coal came in and out of here to go to the mills in Lawrence and Lowell and Manchester, New Hampshire. So this city was exploding, and everything needed to be bigger and better. And there was money around, because of all the money coming into the city coffers from industry, and to build things like this. So this was a wonderful sort of Gothic revival era. And that Gothic revival was really big from the 1840s, the 1860s, and Hawthorne was big into Gothic, stories. He wrote a lot of them. But the Gothic, you always have these sort of arched bridges. The idea is, every time I see buildings like this, and you look at the towers, you think of guys up there with arrows and Ivanhoe, and that was the idea. Was sort of to replicate that old era. But you have these round arch windows, very typical. The towers were very typical. That was part of the whole Gothic thing. So this was a great Gothic revival building. And the fact that it got torn down is just a travesty. And they actually had indoor waiting rooms. And anybody who commutes by train, I was just in Madison, New Jersey, in the train station. It's heated, and Madison's the size of Salem. Heated. They have a place where you can buy coffee. The place looks like a museum. The bathrooms are clean. Then you go to downtown Salem. It's this freezing cold dump, and it's tragic. But of course, the Madison was built in 1900, and back when they did things and they had the money to do them. So, but anyway, Gridley J.F. Bryant did this building, and the Peabody Essex Museum. This is maybe the last issue, or one of the last issues they did of the historical collections. The Essex Institute did it for, I don't know, over 100 years, 4 times a year, and then it became the Peabody Essex Museum Collections. It was a quarterly magazine, but they did this wonderful article in this issue, and it was about Gothic revival Salem. And they talk in there about really one of the big movers in that was Francis Peabody. And again, he didn't go off to sea. He went off to school, and he went to technical school. And his family was one of the great maritime families. And he started all sorts of industries here in town, like lead production and jute bagging and all these strange little businesses that provided jobs and that worked well with the city's economy and workforce. But anyway, he was big into Gothic revival, and nobody seems to know why, but he built the original Kernwood estate up there, and he built a Gothic revival building there. He was very involved with Harmony Grove, laying that out, and he was all about Gothic revival. And of course, Gothic revival required a lot of granite, and of course, it was available from Quincy, and also as time went on from Rockport, right up the coast. So, but he was a parishioner, and a very important parishioner at the First Church on Essex Street. They decided they were going to build, it was the North Church at the time. They decided they were going to build a new building. They had been over here behind the YMCA. So they bring in Gridley J.F. Bryant, and it's almost a cooperative thing between Bryant and Francis Peabody. So anyway, again, here you have these windows, very typical of that Gothic revival style, these arched windows everywhere, the doorways moderately arched, again, you put your guys with the bows and arrows up there on the roof line, and same here. And, it's got a hip roof, but things solidly built, it's granite, it's Gothic revival, and it's wonderful, and it's still there, no surprise, but so what happened was, back to the Tucker DeLand house, when DeLand wanted this house built, he said, I'm not interested in Gothic revival. I want something Italianate that's delicate and exquisite. And so, of course, the customer is always right, unless you're Frank Lloyd Wright, if anybody's ever watched his story. But so he said, all right. So he built him this beautiful Italianate building, which I showed you a little bit earlier. Now, just to the left over here, you see this little arch here? Well, that arch connects the Tucker DeLand house, which we just saw, that was designed by Gridley J.F. Bryant, with Plummer Hall, which designed not by Gridley Bryant, but by a guy named Enoch Fuller. And so Fuller was born in Salem in 1828 and died in 1861. Unbelievable. He only lived like 34 years or so. And he, like McIntire, grew up in a family of people that were in the construction trade. Fuller's father was a contractor and a builder. And he decided after a little bit of time going to sea that going to sea wasn't the best thing. He didn't want to be a worker. He wanted to be, doing something with his mind, and he liked design. So he became an architect. And he left his mark here, and he left this building. This is the Plummer Hall, and it was built for, and I'm sure many of you know this, the Salem Athenaeum. And the Athenaeum had it built in the 1850s, and I think 56 and 57. And again, it's one of these wonderful Italianate buildings. You've got the brick and sandstone and this lovely little balcony, and sort of a variation of a Palladian window here. These are kind of strange little windows here, aren't they? But anyway, I think there used to be a doorway there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they were trying to replicate. I can't remember. This building's gone through so many changes. But anyway, it was built or designed by Enoch Fuller, and it was Italianate building as well. And when he worked in Salem, he almost always integrated that concept of brick and sandstone, and he also designed Immaculate Conception Church. Now, Immaculate Conception Church was built in about 1857, and it replaced St. Mary's, which was down on Bridge Street at the bottom of Mall. They changed the name of the church, the parish, and they got a new building. This one was again brick and brownstone, typical. This tower was not part of it. There's an addition in back that was not part of it. These little loops there, you see them on the first floor, these little round arches, and they're repeated up here. That was sort of Richardson Romanesque. And Richardson Romanesque was this funny little style, and we'll see another building that's sort of like that, but very, very popular. Had sort of crazy roof lines a lot of times, but we'll see another building that has that sort of, this was one of the characteristics of a Richardson Romanesque building. And again, that was one of those mid-19th century things that came and went. But originally this church had a cupola here with a bell tower and some other things, and it got too far gone, so they had to take it down when they did a remodeling back a few years later and redid it. So, but there's a wonderful old picture. I just added this second one because you get to see these old houses on Charter Street. Here, I think this might be the funeral home. I'm not sure, but these buildings, of course, are long gone. There's a little parking lot, the dentist's office there. But and looking over here, there was a little house next to the church. It got burned in the fire in 1914. But you see these wonderful little, look at this little window here, and you see sort of another circular window here, round arch windows here. So they had a lot of fun with this building. The round arch concept, you see it again here, round arches everywhere. That was a very popular, starting with the Adam S. Federal style and going through one style after the other. But in another building, again, that was designed by Enoch Fuller, and he didn't do a ton of buildings in Salem, but boy, what he did, they were massive. And this building was the Superior Court building, and everybody knows it's one of the mothballed ones up on Federal Street. The one on the right was designed by Richard Bond. That's was a courthouse, and then this one's the courthouse. And when this was designed by Fuller, this extended porch was not part of the original design. That was added on to give it sort of more of a Richardson Romanesque feel. They added this wonderful turret here and all this kind of fancy stuff in here to give it a little bit more zip and zap. And they also added this tower in the back. So the building that Fuller designed was a lot more, was functional, but it wasn't quite as fancy. But nevertheless, it was very, very, appropriate for his time and very adequate. And I just thought of this now, and I think John Carr told me this. On this side of the building, you see these little draped hoods that go over the building. And at the bottom, you can see just a little dark spot. Those are little clumps of flowers. Right here, I think, instead of a clump of flowers, I believe is Enoch Fuller's face. And the story that I think John Carr told me was they wouldn't let us put his name on the building. So he said, I'll get them. And he put his face. You can see it if you go over and look on the western side of the building, especially if you have a zoom lens on your camera, you'll see a little face peering out of one of those little capitals from the dripped hoods or whatever. Pretty entertaining. But what a beautiful building. As I said, it's sitting there doing nothing. But by the time that the people who did the redo were done with it, it looked a lot more fancier and exciting and complex. And Richardson Romanesque was very complex. They liked the turrets and multiple, things extending out of the roof and just arches everywhere. And remember, I was saying, like Immaculate Conception, they had those arches over the door. You see them right here again. Sometimes they call them eyebrows, but they had those at Immaculate. Whoops. So, and then the last building that Fuller did, so he was very active. And again, as I was saying, in the mid-19th century, they needed to upgrade everything because the population was growing. You needed bigger courthouses because there's more crime. And, you have all these kids coming for schools. They had to build new schools. And over to the left here was the old Oliver School. And then to the left of that is the, what would start off as Salem Normal School, a college for women. But this is 5 Broad Street. Of course, a lot of it's been written about it. And this was another Fuller building, another wonderful brick and sandstone building, or brownstone. Do I keep saying sandstone? Brownstone. And it was designed by Fuller in the 1850s, and it became the classical and English school. The schools changed all the time. They kept moving them around and changing what schools would be in them, as the population grew. But anyway, you look at this wonderful round arch recessed doorway. The Italian, they loved having these open cupolas on the top. This was probably an addition up here. It doesn't look like it fits, but the Italian, a lot of times you'll see, there's some wonderful buildings on Essex Street, these paired windows. And a lot of times on Italian buildings, you'll see the front, everything is paired. There's some enormous ones on the northern side of Essex Street that are just fascinating. And, everything is paired. And again, you'll see the hoods on the first floor are different than the ones on the second, which I said is typical of that style. And, look at all the heavy bracketing here underneath the roof line. That's very typical. And this is the pediment here. The pediment is this triangular thing here. This is open pediment. A lot of times they'll be closed in, which crowds whatever is inside them, if there's anything inside them. But they chose to leave the pediment, the base of it open so they could get those windows in there, again, with these drip moldings or hoods over the. But what really makes this building, and unfortunately it's gone to hell in a hat basket, is the bell tower up here, and it may end up going the way of the one at Immaculate Conception Church. I guess things under construction. And one last building that he did in the public vein was this wonderful building. It's long gone. And I don't know if anybody knows, this was the headquarters for the Now and Then Hall. And the Now and Then Club was formed in the 1890s. A bunch of young guys got together and they said, let's get together now and then. And by the time they were done, they had this huge membership. This was their headquarters, this wonderful Italianate building right across from the Common. O'Donnell's funeral home is next door. And to the right here is Lukey Burns' old house. And then anyway, it's right in that area, the Hawthorne Hotel parking lot. Maybe it's a hotel. It's right in there anyway. And behind it, they had a huge function hall. So, the Now and Then was very successful. But again, a wonderful Italianate building designed by Fuller. You've got very heavily massed hoods there. I mean, look at, there's nothing delicate about this. Again, the paired window, like I was mentioning earlier, you've got the broken pediment here to make way for this very ornate window, and balustrades that a little. And again, the whole Italian thing, you can almost see Juliet up there singing to Romeo, but anyway, so those are Fuller's buildings, and this is the only one that's gone, but the other ones are just absolutely beautiful, and you can still see them. Some have been altered, some not, but it pays to build in brick or granite, doesn't it? In a town like Salem, where the fire wiped out so many houses. But and right across the Common from the Now and Then Hall, and again, connection to another architect to talk about tonight is the anybody recognize this building?
John Bertram House.
The Bertram home, yep. And the Bertram home from about 1895 until almost 1930 was a private men's club. And it was called the Salem Club. And all of the young hoi poi, were members there. Salem Country Club started there at a meeting. A bunch of guys, Frank Benson and his brother. But anyway, it was, only the privileged were allowed to be members of it. And it was a men's club. And they actually had rooms there that you could rent. They had a dining room. I think they had a billiard room, a library. Women were allowed to eat there on certain days, and there was a fee for that. And they had events there, and so visiting judges who were doing the circuit would stay there, and so it was quite the place. And then the Hawthorne Hotel opened in the 20s and kind of did it in. It became the big gathering place. But anyway, one of the members there at the club, again, a young architect on the rise, was a guy named Ernest Machado. 1868 to 1907. You see, he only lived very young, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But Machado was a very interesting guy, and he was a member of the club, and he was given the task, after they bought it as a private residence, to do the makeover so that it could be turned into a clubhouse. So again, he was a young guy on the rise, and he took to the took to it like a duck to water and did a wonderful job. So there's Machado, very elegant young man. And his family came out of Cuba, and his father actually was descendant of Spanish kings. So that made him a descendant of Spanish kings. And they were living in Cuba, but the problem was, at the time they were living there, there was in the 1870s, there was a great drive in Cuba to separate from Spain, and the Spain government didn't like that. And people like Juan Machado, Ernest's father, got sort of driven out, and he came up and lived in Manchester for a while, met a woman from Methuen, married her. They had a kid, Ernest, and he got schooled a little bit here in this country, I think, and then they went back to Cuba. And eventually the family had to leave for good because they were on the wrong side politically. So they end up living not in Manchester by the Sea, but in Salem on Carpenter Street, in this lovely house. I think it's number 5, and it's a brick house. Sits sideways, and their backyard used to be a sandbar, because remember, the river came all the way up to the bottom of the hill there. And it was great. And they had a large family. And there's a picture, I think Ernest probably set it up, and he was a great photographer. All his photographs are at MIT. And I can't imagine what this guy could have done if he had lived longer, because he's just amazing how many buildings that he did and the quality of them. But so anyway, there he is in the foreground, looking pretty good. And his father, when he came up here, was a real intellectual. So he got a job teaching Spanish at MIT and BU. And one of the beauties of having a father who teaches at MIT is you can probably go to MIT for free, or at least a cut rate. And so that's what Machado did, Ernest. And he wanted to be an architect. Where that came from, who knows what anybody, but so he went there, and while he was there, I've been curious, he went there and he got out, I think, in 1890, but I always wonder if he studied under Ross Turner. Ross Turner, other than Benson, was the biggest name in American art, ever to live in Salem. And he was a huge name in the education art world. He taught at MIT for 30 years, and he taught architectural drawing and watercolor. So you probably had to go through his class, but neither here nor there. So he gets out of MIT, and he works for a bunch of firms in Boston. He hops around from one to the other. They make him a better deal. He's a young guy. He's only in his 20s. And he also starts taking work on his own. And eventually he sets up a little shop of his own up on Church Street somewhere. And he gets, side work or whatever. And then gradually he gets to the point where he decides to leave these firms. He went through at least 2 and maybe 4. These firms all change shapes too. It's kind of hard to get a handle on it, what I read. But anyway, he starts taking on side jobs. And one of the side jobs, remember, in the late 19th century, there was a big fire at the Lyceum. In fact, if you go up to the 2nd floor and you look up, you can see some of the rafters. And they rebuilt it in brick, on pretty much the same footprint. But he did the redesign for it. And this is a drawing. These things just sold at auction, 3 of his drawings. I wish I had known, although it was almost $3,000. But for 3 architectural drawings, and one of them was this one at the Lyceum, which is very, very cool. It's kind of fun. You see this little door over here? And there's the main door. But this little door over here, when George Harrington redid the Lyceum, that door was still there. Remember, this was the restaurant, and over here was the bar. They had a separate entrance, but anyway, then somewhere along the way it disappeared. So anyway, a beautiful drawing. And one of the other things he did was the fraternity, this McIntire building needed a lot of working over. It changed uses. And whatever use was coming up needed to have a lot of work done. And they had to bring in somebody that could be true to the building and, could respect it architecturally. And so they brought in Ernest Machado because he obviously had the right stuff and a lot of the right people were hiring him. So he came in and took care of that job. So he really was responsible for the retrofitting of to the extent this building, the Lyceum, and also the Salem Club. So those are just redos, which often, as people know, it's harder than starting from scratch because you got to work with it. And I think historic Salem may still have some sort of legal right over anything that happens to this building. Some prior sale of the building, and I think they do. HSI, they have these codicils that were built in, and so they're in charge of making sure that the architectural integrity of the building is maintained going forward. So, and again, it's a Bullfinch building. But he also did residential work, Machado, and he was a real go-getter. In fact, his brother John moved up to up to Ottawa, I think, and became a big-time banker. So Ernest, even though he's working in Boston, he's got an office on Church Street in Salem. He opens another office with a guy named Weeks up in Ottawa because his brother's a banker. They can finance anything, hey, no problem. So they built a hospital up there. And he started working all around. He was on the go all the time. But one of the houses he designed was right across the street from where he grew up on Carpenter Street. I think it's number 4. It says it right. I was just down there one day looking at plaques and taking a picture of a house. I'll show you in a minute. And I said, oh, wow, Machado built this. And I think his family owned the one next to it at one point. But so this is a Machado, just a very simple domestic design, little colonial revival. But he was really big into that colonial revival era, the late 19th, early 20th century colonial revival came in with guns blazing. And of course, what prompted a lot of that was the Philadelphia Centennial, in 1876, our 100th anniversary of a country. And all of a sudden, people got interested in the history, and the whole colonial revival movement went crazy, and furnishings and antiques and design. And so the colonial revival became a very popular architectural style. So what they would do is take elements of Georgian, which went from pretty much, say, 1700 to 1725 to Federal, that went on after that or whatever. But those 2 styles, Georgian and, the Adam S. Federal, they would take elements of them and use them. And I always said it's like steroids because, they would have a doorway, a portico here that was much bigger. It looked like everything got greatly exaggerated. You have these corner coins here were very typical of an early Georgian house, the ones that had the gambrel roof. See, there's your gambrel roof. You've got the dormers here, just like you would in a Georgian house, the early Georgian anyway. And then here you have the windows flush up to the roof line, just like an early Georgian. You go down to the Derby house or one of those, built in the early Georgian period up before 1775. You'll see these things. So, so they just used these features from the Georgian and federal periods and built these big, beautiful buildings. And it's Bill Tinty's house, and this is a view of it from the Ropes Garden. Isn't this great? I always said it looks like a mother and child or something. We're twins, but again, you've got that gambrel barn-shaped roof and the corner coins, and it's like crisp and clear. It's such a wonderful New England scene, but he also designed this building, and it's now infamous because this wall in the bottom left finally collapsed. And this is right next to the Pickering House on Pickering Street. And this was designed by Ernest Machado for Harlan Kelsey. And Kelsey became one of the great, and John, you know something about these people, right? And Kelsey became one of the great nurserymen in this area. He came up out of North Carolina, opened an office in Boston, married Daniel Lowe's daughter, moved to Salem, and became one of the most important citizens this city has ever had. And he was amazing what he got done. He created the Salem Maritime National Historic Site, or it's because of him that it happened. But anyway, he built this wonderful wooden colonial revival for Harlan Kelsey and his wife. And of course, here we have the Palladian window, an exaggerated portico, and see up here another balustrade, and you have the dormers up there, and you have the corner coin. So again, colonial revival was very big, and that was just fine with Machado because he was kind of partial up to it. So, but this was another building he built. This one shouldn't be there, but I think it's a double. But he worked up along the shingled shore. He also did the town hall in Hamilton, but this one is out on Misery Island. And if you've ever read Joe Garland's books about the Gold Coast of Massachusetts, the North Shore, Misery Island for a while in the early 1900s, the real early 1900s, became this haven. And they had, this was the clubhouse, and they had a yacht club there. They had a miniature golf course. They had everything. People started building bungalows out there. The only thing was the place was kind of like a Ponzi scheme, as I remember Joe's story, and it all went down. But anyway, a bunch of the buildings were built there, including the clubhouse, were designed by Ernest Machado. So he was working everywhere. Salem Country Club, Ernest Machado, and also Manchester Yacht Club, which I don't have a picture of. So this guy was on the move, on the make. Things were going amazingly for him. You could just tell we're talking Hamilton, Manchester. He's working the coastline, and that's where a lot of the money was. And now he's got this thing going up in Ottawa, and I don't know when he slept. And then in 1902, John, there you go, Harmony Grove, the Blake Memorial Chapel, and he designed that. And it became kind of fitting, and it was kind of ironic because what happened shortly after that was at the age of, I think, 32, I don't know, numbers, he drowned. Ernest Machado drowned. He and a nephew went up on one of the lakes in New Hampshire. They went out canoeing. And one of the accounts I read that Ernest had a surgery of some sort on his shoulder or his arm. So when the boat capsized, he wasn't able to swim or right the boat. He was impaired or whatever, so he drowned, and his nephew survived or whatever. So it was tragic because what a career this guy had ahead of him. And this is a little obituary from the MIT newspaper, and all his photographs, thousands of them, went to MIT. So that's great. But anyway, and it's kind of interesting and almost prophetic because if you go up to Harmony Grove Cemetery, there's a whole clump of, I think, about 6 of these stones. And he designed them all. He was a great photographer. He was an artist. These architects are designers. And he had designed these headstones that lie flat in the ground. And this was his own. And he got to use it quicker than he expected, certainly. But so, and then again, if we go back to the common area and back to, as I said, if we use the Gardner Pingree House as a jumping off spot geographically, I mean, you go to Machado, you can see his work. You can see Fuller's work. You can see all the guys we've been talking about. And if you go like 50 yards, if that, you can see the work of a guy named Philip Horton Smith. And the Hawthorne Hotel was really one of the most important structures ever built in the city because it was built by the community for the community. And it served as the center of life for generations. I mean, it's not so much now because I don't think we don't have the sense of community we used to have, but they built an enormous ballroom at great expense. It was a place where weddings would be had, and parties of everything. And I remember at one point when it went bankrupt in the 70s, Jim Shea, the editor of the Salem News, after a couple of drinks, wrote this editorial that made you cry about this place going down. And he said, it has meant something in the lives of everybody in Salem. And it's true, that just people got married there, they had graduations, after funeral things. It was the center of life for everything. And it was built in the 20s. So the company, I think the architectural firm from New York was hired to build it by the Salem Hotel Corporation, which was all, volunteer group, and Sylvania and Parker Brothers and all those people. By the way, before I forget this, when this place opened, Jim Shea, he wrote in that editorial that he said, for years, Sylvania had a table, Judge Harrington had a table, Parker Brothers had a table, because this is where all the big businessmen went to eat. And they went there every day. They had their own tables. I thought it was pretty cool. But so anyway, a big New York firm was hired to build this, that had experience, because they were building hotels like this all over the country, community hotels. And so they this big company turned right around. They said, we don't know anything about the vernacular architecture in Salem. We have to subcontract, and that's what they did. And they subcontracted to a guy named Philip Horton Smith. There's Philip Horton Smith, 1890 to 1960. And there he is. And Philip Horton Smith was a Salem guy, born in Salem, raised this house. Ernest Machado designed this when Ernest Machado grew up across the street. So they would have been neighbors if they had lived there at the same time, but this is on the corner of Federal and Carpenter. And he grew up in this house, went to Harvard like so many others did, and became an architect when he came out. And he worked for a while for Killen and Hopkins for about 6 years. And he's just a young guy getting his feet wet. And what a good firm they were, because they were working everywhere, big time. And but they were in Salem on a few occasions, and one of them, and who knows if Philip Horton Smith was assigned this gig or not, but this is Prince Street Place, a tiny little dead end in the Point. And after the Salem fire, when the whole place was leveled, Killam and Hopkins went in and built 6, units, wooden houses. Why they let them build in wood is a surprise to me after the fire or whatever. But anyway, so that was one of the gigs that he may or may not have worked on, but his firm did. But then he went off to World War I, and he was there for 4 years. And he stayed after the war ended for a couple of years in France. And what he did was he offered his architectural services. And really a great idea, he obviously had a lot of experience, and it looks good on your resume. So he came back and went into business with a guy named Walker. So you had Smith and Walker. So in the time to do the hotel, we said, we need somebody that understands the architecture that's so prevalent in Salem and how they can blend it with not only the this colonial revival. It's obviously a colonial revival building, but you've got Italianate down the street, then you've got these wonderful all around the common, and you have these wonderful Adam S. Federal buildings. So Smith and Walker got the business, and boy, if you don't think that helped their business, and they just organized in 21, they were in business for 20 years. Walker lived on the South Shore, so he worked mostly on the South Shore, and Philip Horton Smith worked on the North Shore. And when they worked in Boston or out of state, they'd work together. But anyway, this was a huge boon because the community built this. It was their hotel. When the thing was finished, it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, look at all these wonderful, like, round arch windows and, the corner coins. It's just so typical of that colonial revival style. So in fitting with Salem. Great story. They used to have all these stores in here, and up on the second floor, I'll show you something in a minute. But anyway, the northern side of the building, they put in these Palladian windows, and they're just so lovely. They let in a lot of light, but they're absolutely beautiful on the second floor. And then on the first floor, then you see this belt course on the second floor dividing the floors, and there you've got the corner coins, and over here they put on another little addition, I guess, at one point or whatever. But anyway, it's a lovely building, and this stuff is so, Federal neoclassical, and it bridged any number of styles. He played in and round arch windows, and of course you got the little keystones up here. And so, but here's the interior, and I don't know if people remember this. Until '72, the second floor was open, so you could sit up there. When the hotel went bankrupt, they had, I think, 55 women living there, or retirees, not all women. They would sit up there, watch the comings and goings, which one woman told me, in a hotel, they can be very interesting, but anyway, Philip Horton Smith designed the building, he and Walker. And then while they were designing, of course, up on the roof, they have the wonderful Marine Society, and Captain Trumbull, right, Johnny Racket Trumbull? I think he would design anyway. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Nathaniel Bowditch.
But there's Bowditch. Well, Trumbull supposedly designed it and asked Philip Horton Smith for help. So I'll go with Everett, but I think Bowditch was deceased in 1924, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, at that point, Philip Smith, and he's got all these wonderful little interesting projects because it's tercentenary time. And in 1926, you have the 300th anniversary of Salem. So one of the things they did was they tore down the original wooden bandstand and they built this colonial revival bandstand. And of course, who else you can ask to do it but Philip Horton Smith, because he just did the Hawthorne Hotel and it meshed perfectly with everything around it. What a cool shot, huh? One day I was just out there with the camera and the phone and see that reflection. But at the same time, Massachusetts was celebrating its 300th. They picked 1630 as the founding of Massachusetts. There were these different benchmarks that led to Massachusetts becoming official, and they decided 1630 is the year we're going to use. So they had a big tercentenary. And so Philip Horton Smith designed the Pequot House. Of course, the local Native Americans, they were Pequots or whatever. So I'm not living in this area anyway. And so this is a 17th century house. And they used it as a visitor's center and they had exhibits in there. And then it became offices for Shetland, whatever. But and then he was also involved in the Ruck House and helping with the ship Arbella. In the Ruck House, Samuel McIntire was born in the Ruck House. The Ruck House was where the post office is, in the front right corner somewhere. And it's kind of vague, but anyway, there were parts of it left and they moved it up to Pioneer Village. So Philip Horton Smith was involved in so many things in town. He was involved in theater and everything. But anyway, he helped with building the Pioneer Village in 1629. So it'd be ready in time for the 1930 celebration. So he was busy with these sort of quirky, interesting projects. And this must have been a fun one to work with. You're working with George Francis Dow and Harlan Kelsey. And Dan Foley was a 16-year-old kid creating the spice gardens of all spice gardens, and it was great. You had all these people that were so committed, creating really the first living history museum in the country, but he also had very serious work going on. And during the Depression, largely because Bates was our congressman, he was so good, that we got a bunch of money for WPA sort of projects. And one of them was to build a new post office. So they brought in Philip Horton Smith, who had already shown at the Hawthorne Hotel what a brilliant colonial revival guy he was, to build this post office. And so anyway, it's got this, sort of this portico, the middle part sort of extends out from the building. This round arch window thing, again, is carried on. You've got deeply recessed doors here, round arch. The windows are round arch, a bit recessed, with a little fan light here. And the second floor windows, second floor, you've got this belt course running between the floors, typical. You also have these pilasters here, running the length of the second floor. And I always tell kids, if you can get your arms around it and hug it, it's a column. If you can't, it's a pilaster or pilaster. And probably the only thing they take home with them, you got to give them the auto-visual. But here's the pediment. And unlike some of the other ones that we saw earlier in the Italianate style, this one was not left open at the bottom. What they did was they enclosed, and it's a nice sense of scale. They enclosed the little round arch window. And they repeated this pediment on the side on Norman Street as well. So anyway, a wonderful colonial revival building. And they removed the whole neighborhood, of course, to build it. And Philip Horton Smith got the gig. And he also designed, and again, anything look familiar? See the round arch windows, the round arch doorways? This is the beginning of Highland Avenue. This is the old fire company or whatever. And again, typical colonial revival things, just keep adopting the same brick and round arch windows. And, cetera, et cetera. The balustrade, you've got like the sort of thin chimneys, they're not squared, but there's a little hint of something, a belt course that's been interrupted. But anyway, and he also did some liturgical work and clerical work, and he did the new and the current iteration of the Tabernacle Church. And also he did, some of the work on the Grace Church. So he was busy on so many different fronts, and very, very busy and very well connected. But one of the probably the most grueling and exhausting jobs during the Depression, they got money from one of the, I think, emergency management funds, whatever. Before the WPA, before any of those projects, they had this, real crisis money came through to just create work. And there were strict deadlines, and you had to get the work done by then, or they'd shut the money off, and they wouldn't give you part B of the money until you'd shown you had done part one, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the city tore down the city fish market, which was a bit of a variation of this across the way where Lobster Shanty is now. And they really, a lot of sentiment for tearing down the market house. There was a dining room downstairs at this point. The market where they had the butchers and greengrocers, on the first floor was hardly ever being used to a great extent. Everybody was outside. The second floor was used for town building meetings and stuff, but not much. So there's a lot of sentiment for tearing it down, but they couldn't, because if they did, the land would revert back to the Derby and Pictonaires. So they left it up. So they had to do a makeover, and they brought in Philip Horton Smith, and he says, "You got no time and no money. Get this done." So here's what they had to do. Strip the basement and first floors of their old market uses, install public restrooms, boilers, and storage facilities in the basement, introduce 10 new city offices on the first floor. Now, I'm sure everybody's been in there for an event, and that had to be a lot of work to carve up that beautiful first floor with the pillars, but they did. Improve the second floor for stage and seating, and introduce a new stair at the north end, second egress or whatever. So, and of course, the north end is the side that faces Essex Street. So, so that was a lot of work to do, and they got it done. And of course, it changed everything in that area around it, or whatever. But so he was a busy, busy guy. And then the original Collins Middle School, then the high school, was designed by Killam and Hopkins. I mentioned them earlier. And they did the central part in 1908, 1909. But then, of course, as the population exploded, they needed to add on to it. So Philip Horton Smith was brought in. And of course, he had worked for Killam and Hopkins early on in his career before he went off to war. So they brought him in to do like a very sort of these wings on either end that would fit in very nicely with it. Of course, he becomes the guy to go who he showed he could do that sort of thing. But an interesting thing, you look at this building, this is, everybody recognize that, Holyoke Insurance. Well, the original Holyoke Insurance, which was all concrete and steel, is kind of different from anything else that was being built. That was done by Smith and Walker, and I forget the year, and I don't think I wrote it down, which drives me crazy, but nope, I didn't for whatever reason. But anyway, they built that, just the original portion here, and very new for them, completely unlike anything they had done. It's kind of interesting because it's so close to Chestnut Street, and it's right behind the post office. So it's, I think they were just given free rein, design something you want or whatever. And I guess they were pretty liberal because they accepted the final design. But anyway, then later on, the addition here was put on a lot later, maybe even in the 70s. But, and anybody remember the Doyle Mansion? I think it got wiped out by the addition, but the Doyle Mansion, here's Summer Street right here. This is Norman Street that goes, and here's the bottom of Chestnut. So here's Norman Street that goes down to Riley Plaza and Dunkin' Donuts. And this whole corner here, where the new addition is for what was Holyoke, was the rooming house, the Doyle Mansion. And a lot of the old patricians from Chestnut Street lived on it at one point or other. Everybody lived there, the King sisters, everybody at one point. But there's a wonderful article was written about it. What a fascinating, colorful place, but it got wiped out. But he had done work on it as well. And it's one of those buildings that just kept going on and on and on and added whatever else. So Philip Horton Smith was involved in an awful lot of projects around town. And of course, major projects, major high visibility, very important that the construction hold up. And the guy was just a winner. One of the more interesting things that happened was just not long before he died, Eugene O'Neill, the tormented playwright, whose health was horrible. He wasn't speaking to his daughter. His son had just gotten arrested for heroin. Things were not going well for him. He had tremors. And they bought a house with his wife's money out on Marblehead Neck, about 100 yards from the lighthouse out there. And they brought in Philip Horton Smith to do the redo. And every once in a while, I'll be stumbling around on the internet, and finding this story was just fascinating, because Smith and his wife would go over there, and Eugene O'Neill was so nice to him, and he was really not an extrovert, believe me. And Carlotta was very nice to him, and they'd go over and hang out. One day they were over there, they decided they'd just stop in and say hello. And Carlotta turned them away, and she wrote them a nasty note afterwards. It all soured after that. They had no idea why, but the O'Neill's existence out there was short and tortured, But anyway, an interesting thing, because Philip Horton Smith was a member of the Privateers, which was a amateur theater group, and he loved theater. And so to go over there and to be able to meet Eugene O'Neill and to sit there and talk theater with him was just the highlight of his life, But anyway, Smith got married to Eleanor Mahoney, daughter of a McIntire district lawyer, Rob Mahoney, and they ended up moving up to Wenham. But anyway, pretty interesting. So he had quite a career in some real high visibility buildings. And finally, William Rantoul, we're out by with him. His life, 1867 to 1949. And there I find a picture of him. I can blow up enough. But the Rantouls came out of Beverly Farms. His father, Robert, was a congressman, a senator, eventually mayor, and a historian, head of the Essex Institute. He did everything. And William, I think, went to Harvard. I don't remember. But anyway, it's so he had very well connected. And he was one of 9 children, I think. And anyway, he ran into the Phillips family, and he was a great colonial revival architect. And I think that somehow I misplaced the other one. There was a building back further, Racket, and I said, this one doesn't belong here. That's the old Shreve, Crump, and Lowe building in Boston. And he designed that, the original one, before they went in and Art Decoed it later. So, but that should be here. But anyway, this is the Phillips house, and it was moved over and from where North Shore Shopping Center is, and then the Phillipses bought it, just before World War I, and they brought in William Rantoul, who was a great colonial revival guy, to do all sorts of this retrofitting and everything. So he did that job for the Phillipses. And then about a few doors up from the Phillips house, there was an empty lot on the corner of Chestnut and Flint. And people always said, the street looks unfinished. It's like a hockey player with a tooth missing. So Caroline Emerton finally told everybody, shut up. And she bought the land, and she brought in her buddy, William Rantoul. She was very good friends with his father. And she said, all right, do something. So he built this house. He designed this house. And again, it's a brick Georgian. And it's funny, it looks an awful lot by design like the Derby House in Salem Maritime. You look at it, you've got the central doorway, second floor windows are flush. You've got that belt course in between, the same doorway pretty much, and so and it was, he wasn't ashamed of it. He said, this is what it is. The Derby House, when Home and Garden TV were here years ago, I did some filming for them at the Derby House, and they said, if we were Salem, knowing what we know, this is the building in Salem we would highlight more than any other building, is the Derby House. They said, for what it is and what its era, we're hard pressed to find any building that can compare to it than anything we've ever seen, but thank God the National Park owns it. So anyway, he designed this house, and they sold it to the Siemens family, and Caroline Emerton said, all right, shut up, now it's done, the street is complete or whatever. But and then finally, we'll just wrap up with another building. I said way back, Plummer Hall, designed by Enoch Fuller, was owned by the Athenaeum, and they rented out space to the Essex Institute. And then when they decided to move to new quarters, they sold Plummer Hall to the Essex Institute, which promptly built that fill-in to connect the two buildings, the Dayland House and Plummer Hall, by 2 different architects. And if you looked at it, you'd probably think the same guy had to design the whole thing, right? He had to design the left side, the right side, and the piece in the middle. What a beautiful job of integrating them. But anyway, and of course, the Athenaeum then promptly moved, and they built a new building up on Essex Street, which they still use today, another great colonial revival building. And this is a knockoff of Homewood was the name of it. One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence down in Baltimore. This was a replica of his house. So, but that was colonial revival. The truer you were, can't be much truer than to copy a building, that exists from that era or whatever. So anyway, the Rantools were quite a family or whatever. So then one last Rantoul project, the Salem fire wiped out part of Warren Street, or a good part of it, and took out the old Tontine block, I think. And so the Phillips family just called Bill and said, "You busy?" Go in and put some buildings in there. So he designed these beautiful brick row houses, at the corner of Warren and another street, Flint or whatever. Anyway, lovely building. So anyway, and this I put in because I'm wondering if anybody remembers these buildings. If you go over the overpass and turn right where the car wash used to be and go down to the right, there's Franklin Street, the playground. And these buildings, and Ferris's Junkyard's just back here in the back right corner. These buildings were built right after the Salem fire. And I think they had something to do with the fire. And at one point I found out what the story was behind them. I think one of the architects I've talked today was behind them, but I couldn't find anything. And I'm going crazy because I know that there's a story behind them that maybe Killam and Hopkins did. I don't know. But anyway, they were another one after the Salem fire or whatever. And the guy who designed Orange Square, I think, was a brother-in-law to Ernest Machado, who had died, of course, long before the fire or whatever. So anyway, there you go. A little bit about Bulfinch and Bryant and Fuller and Machado and Smith and Rantoul. And if you get Brian Toll's book, you can read about all these guys in the back, and you won't understand 90% of what he's saying because he uses these adjectives, phrases that from architectural world that are just overwhelming. And it's like listening to Michael Harrington talk. The vocabulary is so overwhelming. But anyway, it's a great guide, and there's a lot of other sources that I've used for this, and will continue. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully got through this without any technical issues. I'm glad to have gone through it without any major coughing spells. But so if anybody has anything to add or questions they want to ask, or.
Thank you, Jim. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, just unmute yourself and ask away.
I have a question.
Yes, Racket?
Jim, when the Hawthorne Hotel was being built in 1923, whatever it was, Lukey Burns, who was the mother of Jerry and Bill Burns, had that house to the east of it. That faces west. And was this? Did she marry the architect or the
what
builder?
Happened was I had a great conversation with her about this story, Racket. And right across the street where Essex Cleaners was, in those little shops. There used to be like a soda fountain in there where a lot of the young women would hang out, and they'd watch the construction workers. And she said, Bill Burns, who was the superintendent of he was in charge of the whole project.
Okay.
Said, we met, we'd run into each other because everybody would come into this place. And she said, somebody told him I had money and somebody told me he had money. So we got married. Neither of us had a pot to pee. And it's so Lukey, isn't it? And you wonder where Bill got it, But yeah, so she married the superintendent, the clerk of the whole job. And they had the first wedding reception there. Was Lukey and Bill Burns. Yeah.
There is still a plaque about that marriage on the second floor of the hotel on the back of the Essex room.
Patty Williams and I did those. That was more fun than any project I've ever done, doing the plaques for the hotel. But I'll tell you a great story. Everybody, I'm sure a lot of people remember, Tom Gifford, Helen Gifford from the Salem News. She used to be one of the editors. Helen Gifford's husband, Tom, said that his father had a taxi stand in the Hawthorne Hotel after World War II. And he said one day the men in the bad Union suits came in and had a serious conversation. He shut it down and went into a different line of work. They basically drove him out with threats.
Wow.
But That story, that hotel has a million stories. It's just fascinating, but one other I'll tell you that Bob Kane, K-E-H-N, he ran it for 10 years. I think he and Norman Welch owned it briefly together. But when Bob was running it, for the first 10 years out of the 20 that he ran it, they lived in the hotel. And they had kids, and every time they had another kid, they'd knock out the wall to the next room, so, but the kids grew up in the hotel, and they would just go in to the restaurant and order meals, and that's how they ate, and they had a dog, Charlie of the Hawthorne, this poodle, and they could never find him because he found some old lady in the room down the hall that would feed him, and she had the best stories. And after 10 years, they bought a house in Marblehead. And the first night, it's her big night. She makes this big meal for the family. And the kids said, we don't want that. We want something else. Just, those days are over. But she said her youngest son, Bobby, when he was 4 or 5, would walk around with a toy construction belt. And he said he'd find a light that was out. And he'd go tell the maintenance guys. He said he was like another set of eyes. But, anyway, there's a million stories in the Naked City or whatever. But
God. That's great.
That's so great.
This is more of a comment or a fun little thing. So on my previous commute to work, I would actually walk right behind the Verizon building, which sits on what used to be Rucks Creek. And in fact, behind that building, there's a culvert, and you can actually still hear Rucks Creek flowing underneath the Verizon building. And I'm presumably guessing underneath the post office and eventually into the South River.
Well, Racket, you found the remnants of that creek in your backyard, didn't you, in your barn?
I did. I found Rucks Creek running underneath my barn and straight as an arrow. And I'm sure it goes up under 27 Chestnut Street and 29 Chestnut Street. And if you talk to Liz Pageant, she will show you all the stuff down in their basement, designing around Rucks Creek.
Wow.
And in the Burns's old yard, there's a big trough and a drain. And it's too bad that Creek Street isn't around to tell us all its stories.
Or McIntire's house, for that matter.
Yeah.
I know, what a double blow that was. McIntire's house and the Doyle Mansion went down.
Yeah, both. Wow.
Jeez.
A great story about the Doyle Mansion. They used to have like rooms there for seniors, retirees, like the hotel later did. And and they would have communal meals. They'd have a cocktail hour before. So this guy who ran the Nom Keg Mills came in and sat down. He says to one of his buddies, well, I just threw away $7,000 today. I'll never see. And they said, what do you mean? He says, well, that lovely Mr. Bell, Professor Bell came in and sold me all this stock, in this thing called the telephone. I'll never see that money again.
Yeah.
Oops.
Oops.
Sometimes you just get lucky. But
Yep.
so anyway, those are some of the architects that you don't hear much about, but certainly have left their visual mark in Salem. And, some of them had interesting lives, and 2 of them died before they were 35.
Yeah.
Fuller and
Oscar Pageant, Jim Ballou,
Yep.
a whole bunch of them who did later stuff
Yep.
that, it's marginalized.
Bob Scagliotti.
Scagliotti, yep.
Yeah.
Bob Scagliotti.
Yep. And Oscar and Ballou and Staley McDermott.
Yeah.
Staley
Yeah.
had some really important buildings. Yeah. I was originally going to include them. In fact, I was looking around for a picture of Scagliotti, and then I said, I don't have enough time. I get so much with these people.
Well, if Brian Tolles is still alive, and I don't know if he is or not, it would be wonderful if he would do an updated version of his original architectural book, because he left a lot of stuff out there, and it could be very well revised with his wife's help, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But that is the Bible.
Yeah.
Yep.
I heard somebody.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
He's close with Stanley.
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as I know, he is still alive. He and
He's been here.
Stanley Smith did a couple of walking tours as a fundraising auction prize for I don't know.
Shaker, Canterbury Shaker.
Exactly. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, Canterbury Shaker. And that was, well, just before the lockdown. I think we saw him the last time. And yeah, that's a great idea. Or Jim, for you to do part 2 of this lecture with the more contemporary architects would be great.
One of the car kids, I don't know which, put together this book, and I saw the mock-up, and it's really very, very good, because I've read a ton about that. I got a lot of information about urban renewal, and that might be very interesting. He's done a lot of research on it.
Probably Andrew. Yeah, he was into a lot of that stuff. Yeah.
Hey, speaking of Canterbury, the last resident of the Canterbury Shaker Village was a Salem girl.
Really?
Whoa.
She went up there when she was like 11 years old with her older sister and never came home.
Wow.
Yeah, she was the last one, but yeah.
Wow.
No offense, but Brian Tolles was certainly not Mr. Personality. I'm not sure you're gonna get that to fly, but that's cool.
Well,
Yeah. Remember, he used to go, he had those skis on wheels.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Yeah, you see them all, going around this thing.
Jim, I've got a question for you.
Yep.
First period architecture, 1626 to maybe 1715. There were no architects back then, were there?
No.
I mean, who built any of those houses? They were just kind of chicken coop carpentry. They were ex-shipbuilders who were put to work building houses and did the best they could and didn't sign their work.
They were cobbled together, yes.
Yeah. And like McIntire, when he started, he was no architect, he was a builder. He was a building guy, but they had all these books from England, and the real architects could tell you the names of all of them. But so they'd go through the book with the guy they were working with, and they'd say, how about a little of this, little of that?
Right.
Yeah. So you just, ripped off this stuff from England, and hey, think about this. Well into the 1800s, Harvard used to send all their chairs of the different departments for Europe for seasoning. That's how little we had here culturally and educationally. Harvard.
For what, Jim?
For, to be educated themselves.
Oh,
and
okay.
Prepare them to be the chair of a department. You'd send them over to Europe, which was around forever and had a much higher threshold of, grasp of everything you needed. So they'd send them over there. So, we were just babes fooling around in the woods. Culturally and educationally and in so many different ways, But
I got another question, Jim, too. Out of all the architecture that we talked about today, do you have a favorite?
I love brick and brownstone, but I really like Philip Horton Smith too, because of the array of things he worked on, I don't know, but I always do just all sepia, but there's some pictures here I'd say, damn, I should have left this color, just so you could see some brick and brownstones or whatever. I did myself in. But.
Jim.
Yep.
I'm not sure you're gonna know the answer to this question, but do you have any idea when the finials were removed from the top of the Hawthorne Hotel?
No, I didn't know this. They were.
Oh yeah, they're gone.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to
when
that
that
one either.
happened.
Although knowing Michael, he might have had them sent out to be fixed.
Oh no, they've been
No.
gone for a long time.
Oh, they have.
Oh yeah.
Did you ever see what used to be on the roof of the YMCA building? They had a whole pavilion up there. It looked like a grape arbor on steroids, like it was a whole portico and
Oh,
everything.
yes, yeah. I have
Really?
seen that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jim, do you know who did the YMCA building? Do you know who the
Oh, yeah.
architect was?
Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
But consider this. It's
Samuel
hard to-
McIntire had a son, Samuel Field McIntire,
Yeah.
who was not an architect, but he did a lot of carving.
He was a furniture maker.
Whatever happened to his background?
I don't know. I don't.
Just
I owned
about
a sideboard of
shadow
his that was at
father.
35 Chestnut Street for a long time. As far as my knowledge goes, it's still there.
I did a lecture one time about a year ago on the North Shore on Antiques Roadshow, and it was so much fun. But they had a Marblehead or a McIntire bellows, that.
Oh, I remember that.
No. They had a McIntire medallion of Washington, one of 9. He did very simple planes.
Yep.
And this thing had been exhibited when Lafayette came to Boston. I think that's when they said in 1824, one of his trips. And the thing they estimated was worth, I think, $900,000. And this wasn't painted or anything. It was just this real simple thing. But I think that was the.
What was it?
It was just a medallion, a carved medallion of Washington.
Oh,
He did better with wheat sheaves than he did with people, I think.
Yeah.
I actually also have a book on McIntire, and it's Ship Carvers of North America. And as highly regarded for wood carving as he was, he did not do the best work on ships.
They had a thing somewhere about, he attached himself to Derby early on, and what a dream, because King Derby, he was the man. So if you as an architect or carpenter are good enough for Derby, you're all set, right? So, but they said that McIntire, I remember reading this somewhere, and I think I saw it again recently. They said at the drop of a hat, he'd run down and fix Derby's gate or repair a birdhouse, take care of the guy, no matter how menial the job, it doesn't matter.
Jeff, I think I read someplace that McIntire did have a couple of figureheads, ship's figureheads, which were worshipped as deities in foreign ports, though.
Yeah, his work compared to the guys in Boston, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman in Boston, and there was a guy in Philadelphia who was the #1 that everybody wanted, but he did do the ship carving. McIntire did do the ship carving on the frigate Essex, the sternboard and the figurehead, but I obviously have no idea what happened to them. I presume went back to England when the ship was captured.
Or got blown off in Valparaiso or whatever.
Yeah, well, I don't think about that.
Yeah. Well, folks, thank you for being such an involved audience here.
Thank you, Jim. This was terrific. We'll look forward to part 2.